Thanks so much for being here. I know it's been a beautiful couple of days in the conference so far, and it's a full day ahead of us. So I would like to get started. And my name is Father Sean McGraw. I'm a Holy Cross priest. I teach political science here. I'm one of the founders of our Alliance for Catholic Education teacher training and formation program, and it's a real privilege to be able to moderate today's panel. We have some pretty distinguished colleagues and leaders and scholars in the field of international education and development, and so we're really looking forward to this session this morning, where we really want to kind of talk about the policy area. We want to think about what progress have we made, and we also want to think a little bit towards the end. We're not just going to talk. We want to think about what are we called to do kind of going forward, and so what are some action items that we want to think about. So much has changed in this area, so we want to reflect a little bit on where we've come from, where we are today, and where we're going in the future. The format for this morning will be that in a minute I'll introduce our distinguished panelists. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A. I might take moderator's privilege and ask the first few questions, and then also have questions from the audience as well. I think in light of the themes of the overall conference, it's really important for us to think about, as we have in all of the sessions, the Pope's call for us to think about developing this new kind of ethic of ecology. And he has some beautiful words about kind of this notion of conversion, that we have to move beyond kind of technocratic solutions to also consider the whole person. And so our panel will help us think about this. The Pope has this beautiful line: how do we help people through effective pedagogy to grow in solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care? Which is a beautiful kind of invitation and challenge for us this morning. So let me introduce our four panelists, and we'll go in the order. I'll introduce all of them, and they'll speak in turn. First, we have Stephen Heyneman, who's Professor Emeritus of International Education Policy and Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organizations at Vanderbilt. He served in the World Bank for 22 years, designing policies to support educational effectiveness. He was responsible for education policy and lending strategy, first for the Middle East and North Africa, and then later for 22 countries in Europe and Central Asia. So Stephen will share some of his expertise. Second, we have Radhika Iyengar, who has a PhD in economics of education from Teachers College at Columbia. She has an award-winning dissertation on social capital and education in rural India, and she's just a real kind of up-and-coming star in the area. She's the education director for the Millennial Villages Project for 10 countries in Africa, and they're scaling up operations at the Earth Institute of Columbia, so we're really excited to have Radhika here as well. Third, we'll have Bob Prouty, who's the former head of the Global Partnership for Education. During his tenure, they more than doubled their size, working in 60 countries and dispersing over $400 million annually. Since his quote-unquote retirement, Bob has been working with several UN organizations and the EU on a range of programs, and most recently he's been helping us a lot with the Notre Dame's work in Haiti on literacy, and so we look forward to hearing from Bob. And then finally we have Dana Burde, who is an associate professor and director of international education at NYU. She's a member of several institutes there and also works a bit in conjunction with the Peace Studies at Columbia. Her research focuses on the effects of conflict on education, the efforts of humanitarian organizations to mitigate these effects, and the relationship between education and political violence or peace. All four of them have had pretty dramatic travel to get here, and hiccups along the way, so we're grateful for your efforts to get here and to share your expertise. So you're obviously welcome to sit or you're welcome to stand, and we'll start with Stephen. Please welcome our panelists.
Good morning.
Morning.
So this is titled A Future for Education Assistance. The Keough School of Global Affairs has gathered us to discuss an issue titled For the Planet and the Poor. I've been asked to say a few brief words about education. I will do so by first mentioning what the international community will no longer need to do, and then outline the educational requirements for the planet and the poor in which the international community may have a role of critical importance. What is no longer needed? Since the World War II, the West, led first by the United States, has been engaged with the task of helping to finance countries in need. This first took the form of assistance to repair the infrastructure destroyed during the war, then assistance to build capacity in the newly formed independent nations, and then all nations defined as developing. Education became part of the overall ODA, Official Development Assistance Strategy, in the early 1960s. For instance, the World Bank began lending for education in 1962. We have had more than 50 years of experience with helping to finance education development by building schools, by providing equipment, and by underwriting recurrent expenditures. This education assistance is no longer needed in the same way, and today should shift to new purposes for two reasons. The first reason is that it may no longer be wanted. Independent since the 1960s, countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are no longer inexperienced. Kenya and India have the resources and the responsibility to decide their own futures. To many, it appears inconsistent to subsidize nations to build schools when they have ample resources to fight wars with their neighbors, develop nuclear weapons, and in several cases, explore space. No American political party, no American political candidate has released a statement supporting education foreign aid. Instead, it seems toxic, a political third rail. It is so unpopular that it is avoided by all who run for office. The public is influenced by stories of corruption, of education ministers driving in Mercedes-Benzes, of phantom teachers, of donor monies which supplant domestic education budgets. Donors are asked to pledge higher contributions from their tax base. No recipient nation is asked to do the same. That seems unfair. If more controls are placed on the transfer of resources to make certain that they are targeted properly, the more foreign aid is portrayed by local politicians and by university professors in our own country as serving the self-interest of the donor. That seems ungenerous. The second reason has to do with the evidence of economic effectiveness. For half a century, we have assumed a human capital model of development. We have fine-tuned economic rates of return. We have globalized production functions based on ever larger participation in cross-national studies of academic achievement. And we have scattered cost-benefit analyses and randomized trials around the globe. There are two problems with this. The randomized trials constitute tests which elicit an elegant and precise answer to what are often mundane questions. Which method works better? Should children have vaccinations and school lunch, or only vaccinations? We need to admit that learning is not an analog to medicine. No medical model will work because learning is generated by motivation and by purpose. However, the last 4 decades of education research has elicited some lessons. What have we learned? We have learned that more education has profound consequences, particularly on girls. We have learned that books are needed when trying to teach literacy. Good morning, Vietnam. We have learned that quality has economic and social impact. We have learned that putting a child in school is only the first step of a long process of quality education. But so what? These lessons are self-evident. Do we really need more data points to be convinced that putting girls in school in Bangladesh is a good idea? Do we actually think a randomized trial pitting a new way to teach literacy will answer the question of how much to spend on higher education or on handicapped education, which are two questions which are profoundly important to every education minister. There is no nation, including ours, which decides an education budget on the basis of a regression equation. What gives us the impression that once again regressing education against economic growth in Tanzania will elicit information which we do not already have? The truth is that we have come to the end of the utility of social science data to inform nations as to how they or how donors should allocate resources. These expensive uses of foreign aid are both costly and wasteful and should be put to for more pressing purposes. What is needed? Where there are natural disasters, such as in Haiti, repairing the damage to education will be a permanent part of our landscape. However, with respect to nation building, we must remember that the original purpose of public education was not to train children to calculate, but to mold citizens. From the beginning, the purpose of public investments in education have been to create socially cohesive communities. The international donor community has neglected this fact. It has allowed their models to bypass the original purposes of education, and now it is time to right the balance. With over 3 million migrants fleeing civil conflict in the Middle East, with a growing number of failed states, with the prospect of new and devastating intra- and inter-religious war, the need for quality education has never been greater, and the need for new pioneering research on the quality of education has never been greater. But we must learn from the past. In the past, the international community has chosen to be excused from the content of education. To ask about the content was seen as an abrogation of national sovereignty. For the 22 years in which I served to help direct education at the World Bank, we never became involved in what was taught. This is a luxury which the world can no longer afford. Schools and universities are not an unalloyed good. Schools and universities are like any other tool. They're like a hammer or a knife. They can be used for good, or they can be used to cause harm. It is time to recognize what we in education research know, but have not widely discussed, that social tensions between Israel and Palestine, between Muslims and Christians in Bosnia-Herzegovina, between the Tamils and Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, and between Japan and China and Korea, all are exacerbated by what is taught in school. This means the means by which schools affect social cohesion are well known, and there are 4 of them. The first is through formal curriculum. The second is through the climate created in the classroom and on school property, playgrounds, hallways, lunchrooms. The third is through the public's perception as to whether schools are being fair. The fourth is the degree to which the public has a voice in influencing educational content, particularly with respect to history and moral standards. There are ways to assess the degree to which schools and school systems are doing a good job positively affecting social cohesion, but these have not been well explored in terms of international education research. There are international agencies which have a mandate to offer advice and consultation to member states who seek better understanding as to the social cohesion performance of their schools. But these mandates have rarely been utilized and are underfunded. And if they are shown the way forward, then there are bilateral agencies, American, British, Japanese, French, who might see the necessity of developing new work on this set of education issues. The contribution of education to social cohesion is closely allied with other global goals, with human dignity, with health, with environmental sustainability, among others. But to my knowledge, there's no private foundation, nor is there a think tank which has taken on this task. Because the social and attitudinal role of education is closely linked to faith-based motives, most international organizations have steered clear of it. I would think, however, that this line of investigation and assistance might fit well within the objectives and the terms of reference of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame.
Thank you. Very provocative, and look forward to following up with some questions. Thank you, Stephen. So next we'll go with Radhika.
So after Stephen's macro view on education, these slides, couple of slides mention 3 or 4 key points that have come up based on my experience in India and in 10 African countries, in 10 sub-Saharan African countries through the Millennium Villages project. So I'll go over these main points. Before that, just to give you a quick glimpse on where we work through the Millennium Villages project, it's in sub-Saharan Africa. We followed mainly in rural, work in rural, remote village clusters in these sites. And the most important part to me is this intersectoral approach that we followed. If you were there in Jeff's presentation yesterday, it talks about how we want to achieve sustainable development goals, and we cannot really favor, if we need to work on development, we cannot really favor one or the other sector. So we really need to work intersectorally, and that was something trained in education when I came to the Earth Institute and started working 6 years back. That was something that helped me to have a transformational, learning on my own. How do we really work with agribusiness? How does education, what are the links of education with agribusiness? What are the links of education with infrastructure, water and sanitation? So huge benefits of working together, and thankfully the Sustainable Development Goals gives us a framework of working together. Again, it's great to have goals, but once these goals are set, when we start operationalizing, the countries start operationalizing these goals, the strategies become very nuanced and very contextualized. For example, just to give you a sense of the strategies that different countries adopted to meet the SDGs, to meet the MDGs, is first there was a construction, there was a boat that the teams had to make in Mali. To make sure that children from one side of the river would go to the other side of the river to go to school. So goals are great, enrollment, 100% enrollment, but the strategy is completely varied. The second picture is when in Prouty in Senegal, the teams had to do street plays and have community theaters and other things going to ensure that they pass on this message of having these children go to school in a timely manner and not really late, or they attend school in time. The third picture is when this person is giving award to this girl who participated in a football match in Nigeria, and there were all these games, and the girls participated, boys also participated, and along with that, the principal or the headmaster of the school said that sent out the message that children should be enrolled in school. There were lots of parents collected, so that was another way. Since sports is so popular in Nigeria, the principal came up with this innovative idea of bringing everyone together through sports and then passing on this message why education is more important and why children should be going to school at the right age. And the last picture is when in Malawi, there was this distribution of agriculture, like fertilizer, to families. At that time, the community leaders decided that they need to spread the word of education again and have children come to school regularly. So the community leader, while giving these fertilizers, also spoke about education, that children should be coming to school in time. So again, it's great to have goals, but the next set of strategies is how these countries adopt these goals and what are the operational parts of it and how they want to operationalize sending children to school. Sending children to school is great, but we soon realized that that was only the first step. As Stephen also mentioned in his discussion that children are going to school, but really they need to be learning. And we realized that in the countries that we work in, and this became a multi-country phenomena, in fact a multi-continent continent phenomena where children went to school, even if they went to school on time, they were not learning anything. They were just sitting, and many countries like Ghana, India have automatic promotion, so they move ahead from one grade to the other without learning anything. And by the time they graduate, they are far behind. They have only grade 2 level competencies or not even that. So again, SDGs lend itself to improving the quality of education and through lifelong learning approaches, which I think is high time that we really focus on the learning that happens in the schools. Again, we realized that it's great. We did, the countries did a lot of teacher training. We worked with government schools. The government school inspectors were there to do a lot of teacher professional development. But learning should not be constrained to just schools. We shouldn't be blaming the teachers and the school system that children are not learning. What is the responsibility of the community here? With or without SDG or MDGs, I think it's the parents and the communities themselves are responsible for ensuring that all children need to go to school and learn. So here is a model where in Malawi, they had they instituted these village learning centers, VLCs, where we again learned from the health sector and had a community health worker type of group, volunteers, community education worker groups, where these volunteers were secondary school grades, they had competencies of secondary school, they've passed out to secondary school grade, but they were able to teach these children basic literacy and numeracy. So again, this is a good model. This was done after school, just to show that communities themselves they don't have to wait for the school system to make sure that the children learn, but also take up this responsibility of the volunteers doing teaching at the same time, and making sure that children at least are learning basic local languages and basic numeracy. Again, this is just a start. We need to get to where Steve is saying that we need to have citizenship and, we need to have civic education and history and other things, but children need to be literate first, and we had these challenges in our sites. Again, there are lots of methods to improve literacy, but we really need to rely on what cognitive neuroscience has given to us. There's a lot of literature on how children learn based on cognitive neuroscience models, which have worked. So again, RCTs on which model works, which model doesn't work, doesn't make sense. We know that this model has been tried and tested in many places and should be executed. So we were lucky to have this particular model. Also, it took place in Malawi, and the government was a part of it. The government schools were involved. The government administratives, again, were involved in going to all these classes and seeing how this model is actually played out in the class. So what the community education workers or the volunteers did was they emphasized on the letter sounds rather than letter names. Again, this is meant only for local language. English and French learning is far more complicated, and most countries have local language literacy policies, at least in the first few years. So that's a great positive point, that the countries have adopted local language literacy first and then transition to French or English depending on either they are in West or East Africa. So the model basically includes emphasis on letter sounds, teaching one letter per day, going really slowly, understanding where the children are. The focus is not to complete the curriculum, the focus is to make sure children learn. They should move ahead every day from where they were the previous day. Then blending sounds together and decoding these words. Individual practice rather than just the instructions being given by the teacher and rote learning happening. It's more dealt with classroom teacher practices and individual practices that the teacher need to really focus on. And then corrective feedback for every student that the teacher provides. Rather than just doing instructions, the teacher goes around in groups giving feedback, corrective feedback to students. So again, this has been tried and tested in many places. So I think we should stop exploring and experimenting with new ideas. Look at the literature. There is a big gap between what has research said and the link between research and implementation is very weak. So let's go back to what science tells us about how children learn and use those science-based facts. This model was again tried in one of the states in India, Telangana, where the government was seeing that there is a lag of children not learning again. They were in grade 5 and couldn't even do grade 2 level work. So they really knew that they need to step up and do more literacy, local language literacy. In this case, it was Telugu language. So again, this model went from Rwanda to Malawi to India. So the South-South cooperation model, I think, is a wonderful way of learning, and how we can actually use science-based methods to improve learning really should be adopted, rather than people wasting money and donor money and irrespective country money, government money should not be spent on things that have not been researched. Another thing that we learned through our work at the Earth Institute is real-time data collection, and I give all the credit to Sarah Sievers. Through her Nigeria Scale-Up project, we were able to track every school and key indicators of where these schools are and how well they are performing in terms of basic inputs that they need to be having. So the Nigerian ministry was able to track every school, every rural school in Nigeria, in all the districts. They call it the local government areas. And we were able to see where these schools are located and use the money where there was a gap. So again, data-driven methods of planning and filling in the gaps was very, very critical. The most important part here was data takes a lot of time. We didn't have a lot of time at hand because there were children who were there who needed assistance in those schools. So we used phone-based data collection techniques, again something that we learned from the health programs on how they collected data and diagnosed children and diagnosed parents if they had diseases. So again, using database collection was very helpful in this case. The data could be used so that remediation could be done at the same school year, rather than children actually leaving the school and not really benefiting from from the data. And I guess my last point is the data should be shared with communities, with the schools, with the governments. Having that ecosystem of where the data should be shared, I think, is very, very critical to having any data-based impact on education. It's not something new. I think Sonia would have shared the same idea of the systems-based approach that require the SDGs operationalizing. We cannot work on one or the other part of education. We have to take the entire system and work with the entire system, because unless we work with the entire ecosystem for education, we will not be able to meet the SDGs for education. It has this lifelong continuum that we need to focus, and just taking a primary school or just taking secondary school or just working with the government systems won't really we won't be able to meet the SDGs for education. Thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. It's great to see how you've taken advantage of your award-winning research in India and started to apply it in Africa, so thank you. So we'll ask Bob Prouty to speak next.
So thank you very much. I really want to thank the Keele School of Global Affairs for inviting me here and for giving me the opportunity to complain and to have an audience for that complaint. I'm used to complaining and having a hard time getting an audience. I'm going to talk fairly narrowly today on the topic of obstacles to achieving the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll even take a look in the rearview mirror about lessons learned or not learned from the Millennium Development Goals. And really, maybe that's my key complaint. with the Sustainable Development Goals and where we're going right now. It's kind of, have we learned nothing? That would be my broad complaint. If you were to read some of the recent analyses of the effort to achieve education for all over the period 2000 to 2015, so the Millennium Development Goal period, you would come away from these analyses with one clear impression, that the great obstacle that was faced over that period and the great reason for not having achieved even more success than was achieved was the lack of adequate financing. In fact, some of the most important documents say that was the problem. The 2015 EFA Global Monitoring Report, this is a direct quote, "The lack of adequate finance was among the most significant obstacles to achieving the Education for All goals." Looking forward to the SDGs, well, very similar language. September of last year, the International Commission on Financing Global Education Opportunity was created under the auspices of the United Nations with 20 eminent world leaders as members, and a mandate, I'm quoting again, to examine how to reverse the lack of financing for education around the world, which has left 124 million young people out of school and hundreds of millions without quality learning opportunities. I think this panel is great. I think the people on the panel are great, so I don't want to call that into question. But I am going to call into question the premise here. The lack of financing is posited as the prime reason that so many children are out of school, and therefore increasing the financing is posited as the solution. And I know that explanation has been put forward to some extent at this event, so I recognize that I'm somewhat at risk here of being disagreeable, but I'm going to disagree with that premise. I'm not arguing that more funding would be a bad thing. And if there are any wealthy donors out there, or wealthy potential donors, I'll get back to you shortly on that, because more funding would be helpful. Nevertheless, the main item on my list of obstacles to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is not financial frameworks, but fairness frameworks. Let me just give you a simple factoid. Children from the poorest households are 4 times more likely to be out of school than children from the wealthiest households. That's interesting enough, I guess, but when you look at the numbers, it's not like 1% and 4%, it's 10% and 40%. Children from wealthy households, still a pretty high number, but something like 10% out of school for a range of reasons. But from the poorest households, it's almost half of children out of school. And more financing won't necessarily get them in school. And I'm going to say a word about that, but let me take time out just for a moment for a word from our sponsor, Pope Francis. Our efforts at education will be inadequate and ineffectual unless we strive to promote a new way of thinking about human beings, life, society, and our relationship with nature. He also said, how can anyone claim to be building a better future without thinking of the sufferings of the excluded? I had another quote, but Father Sean already took that one from me. So let me get back to the fairness framework. My concern is that after all this time, we still haven't recognized the importance of getting certain social structures in place within the education sector that are sorely lacking, and that have been sorely lacking, and that we in the international community have often contributed to. These are things that we often now seem to see as normal and necessary, and yet they're inherently inequitable. Let me just talk a little bit about one of these areas, that the social environment in which schooling takes place in many developing countries. Most kids in wealthy countries go to school in the language they speak at home. This is very nuts and bolts stuff I'm going to talk about here. They learn to read in the first few months if they don't already know how to read when they get to school. And when you contrast that with primary schooling in developing countries, most children in developing countries go to school in a language they don't speak at home. Most of them, not just kind of many of them, most of them. Most will take 4 to 5 years to learn to read because they're still learning the language. A recent study of children grades 4 to 6 found that in that group, grades 4 to 6, so after being in school already for a number of years, fewer than 50% could read or do basic, or could read at what was considered acceptable initial levels or do basic math. Another statistic, for 80% of, they're still, depending on the estimates, something like 57 million children still out of school, say 60 million. About half of what it was going into the Millennium Development period. And for about 80%, a stunning figure, but for about 80% of those children who are still out of school, the nearest available school would not be available in their language. So you see the disconnect between the family, the social environment, and the school. You can already see I'm going to end up in a place, probably going a little different direction here, but going to end up in a place not that far from where Steve ended up. I shouldn't give away the ending, but I think you can see it coming. I'm going to quote another Steve here very briefly. Steve Walter, who did a study of the Kam ethnic group in Cameroon. He once estimated that the children in that group, by the age of 9, had been exposed to about 3,000 words in text form. So not a very text-rich environment, about 3,000 words, and 0 words in the language they spoke at home. In this country, children will read on average 3,000 to 5,000 words a day. So what that means is that a 9-year-old child in Indiana has more opportunity to read in a single day than some 9-year-old children have had in their entire lifetime. I actually just saw a figure just this past week that said the average person will be exposed to, not actually read, but will be exposed to 100,000 words of text per day in the current kind of saturated media environment just by opening up a lot of things on the internet. So that begs the question, of course, of what we're doing to try to even the playing field a little bit. And by the way, the rarest commodity in developing countries is a reading book in a language the child understands. Not only do we not have textbooks, there might be a few textbooks, there are no reading books, and certainly graded readers, which you would consider to be the basic tool of an elementary school, available in the US since the McGuffey readers were first brought to the market in 1836. Virtually non-existent in developing countries. So in terms of the connection between the social environment and the school, we have a long way to go. I want to just give you another example about some of the social constructs that we bring to the schooling environment, and I'll try to speed this up. An example from Zambia, community schools in Zambia. Like in many countries, many low-income countries, community schools cater to the poorest and most disenfranchised children. 1/3 of primary schools in Zambia are community schools. Yet they get virtually no support from the international community, virtually no support. 90% of their teachers are untrained, and therefore they are considered somehow below the radar for the international community. As I said, many other countries have similar arrangements. And the point simply here is that we have in our minds taken a social construct of what school is and who school should cater to, and we have tried to kind of push that framework down further and further to lower and lower levels of children, but we've done that quite unsuccessfully. It's very hard to push that model down very far, and I believe that the fact is that there's a fairness framework here that needs to be addressed. If we can't be working with these schools, it's hard to understand why we're working with any schools. I want to say a quick question about secondary schooling. Again, just a nuts and bolts question here. In country after country, children's opportunities to continue their schooling after primary school are severely curtailed by a lack of secondary schools. A couple of numbers. In Mozambique, 1 in 3 children from the top income quintile will complete lower secondary. So you can see already, not very many, but 1 in 3 from the top income quintile will complete lower secondary. 1 in 200 from the lower income quintile will do the same. So those numbers are pretty dramatic. If we stay in Mozambique, even that little gap between primary, just a couple more years up into secondary, lower secondary, that little gap of 3 years. 1 in 2 primary completers from the upper wealth quintile will manage that, keep in school for 3 more years and finish lower secondary. From the bottom quintile, 1 in 30 will manage that. So why is it so hard for children to go through? Certainly no fault of their own, and I would say no fault of their teachers. There's a model of secondary schooling that simply isn't relevant for the rural parts of the country and for poor families. The curriculum requires high degrees of teacher specialization. Those teachers aren't available in poor parts of the country. The system is built around large secondary schools, and those necessarily require good access to transportation. Secondary schools are inherently biased against the poor, and there's no good reason for it. It's a social construct that doesn't work for poor children. I'll go quickly. I won't talk much about higher education. I think it's obvious, higher education. World Bank report found that a very recent report, a year ago, found that higher education in most developing countries magnifies income inequality. Carnoy and others did this study in the 4 BRIC countries and found that same thing, that in none of those countries did higher education reduce income equality. Vietnam, poorest, there are numbers like this across all countries. The poorest quintile, 9.2% less likely than the wealthiest quintile to go on to higher education. I'll drop off a couple more examples and just wrap it up, trying to come to the same point that Steve came to. And this is the question of what it is we do going forward over the next 10, 15 years to make sure we don't repeat what happened in the last 10, 15 years. And if we think that the first and most urgent thing to do is to raise more funding, then I think we're going to repeat the experience of the last 10 to 15 years. There are social constructs in place that need to be addressed first. All of this raises the question of what is the role of the international community. On this, I'll probably have somewhat of a different perspective. I think it's too early for the international community to pull up stakes and move on. And we can leave that for the question and answers or for a later period to discuss exactly what that would be. And I think for Notre Dame and for the Keough School of Global Affairs, I think there are a lot of questions, I think tough questions that need to be asked to say, how can the tradition, the Holy Cross traditions and other traditions that underpin this work, how can those traditions be brought to bear so that they strengthen the international dialogue around these very issues that I think are going to be make or break in terms of success going forward. Let me just give the last word here to Pope Francis. Before saying that, I will simply say that when we've got the fairness frameworks right, then I think we can start talking more about the financial frameworks. But let me give the final word to Pope Francis, as somebody who doesn't mind telling it like it is, but who at heart is an optimistic sort of a guy. 3 statements, and you will recognize the source of these statements. Number 1, we know that things can change. Number 2, humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. And number 3, we need a conversation that includes everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Dana, you're up. Thank you very much.
So I wonder, should I put this on top of this? Should I move this? I'm wondering, is it even necessary? I'll just put it on top. I'll be gentle. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks to Scott and Sarah and the Keough School and Notre Dame for inviting me. And thanks to my terrific panelists. I enjoyed hearing their comments, and they've set me up perfectly for what I want to say. So I'm going to talk about, as asked, Sustainable Development Goal that relates to education. And I'll just read it so we all have it in our minds. It is urging us to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning. I'll return to this lifelong learning point in a minute. Opportunities for all. So in light of this focus, I'm going to talk about girls' education abroad, and I'll also talk about solidarity and tolerance at home. First, I'll talk a bit about how trendy girls' education has become. You may have noticed, you may not have noticed. And one phrase that expresses this movement in the West, which I quite like, actually, it is, I'll tell you that phrase in a minute. I'll talk about also my research on girls' education in Afghanistan. And I'll wrap up by describing a couple of steps that I think we should take, including focusing on promoting education and tolerance right here at our university campuses across the country, led by faith-based universities. These days, there's a lot of talk about girls' education, how important it is, for example, because getting girls into school has financial dividends. Low-income countries everywhere will not be able to lift themselves out of poverty if they don't educate girls and women. Unless the whole population is educated, these countries will not be able to lift themselves out of poverty, nor will our neighborhoods lift themselves out of poverty if we don't have good access to schooling. There are also huge demographic and health benefits, which are familiar to most of you, I'm sure. Educated women have fewer children. The children they choose to have are healthier. And there are many, many, many other reasons to support girls' education. There's also a lot of talk about those who don't want to support girls' education. Who are those people? Frequently, fingers point to, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan, or men, especially Muslim men. A lot of organizations are working to promote girls' education abroad, including in countries affected by conflict, including in Muslim countries affected by conflict. Some of these organizations have been around for a while. The Nike Girl Effect campaign, all of the efforts launched by international NGOs, international non-governmental organizations like CARE. CARE has an girls' empowerment program. CRS might be familiar to many of you, Catholic Relief Services, which is a terrific organization I know well and work with closely in Afghanistan. And I am also encouraged by their efforts to do their work incredibly effectively and not proselytize at the same time, which is essential when working in a Muslim country if you're a Christian faith-based organization. Not all of them do that. CRS does it well. I'll return to that in a minute as well. Many other initiatives have sprung up in the past several years. For example, you might have heard of an organization called Girl Rising, promoted by a lot of people from Hollywood, among others. The No Ceilings Project, which is sponsored by the Clinton Foundation. And of course, the Malala Fund that was started after the Pakistani schoolgirl, Malala Yousafzai, was shot by the Taliban because she was advocating for girls' education. It seems like almost everywhere we turn, people are talking about girls' education. Or maybe that's in my world when I look around. And they're also talking about violence. I suppose that's also my world because of the research I do on education in countries affected by conflict. And of course, I'm not complaining about this trend because it is exactly what I study. Violence against education in countries affected by conflict, often focusing on girls. And it's interesting to hear the way these organizations represent their work. When people working for these organizations talk about why they support girls' education and why everyone else should too, they say, and this is the phrase that I was referring to a moment ago, they say, it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. When I first heard this phrase, I thought it was brilliant, hitting both the moral and economic birds with one stone. I still like the phrase, but I'd like to extend it to a whole lot of other issues related to girls' education and to education and tolerance here at home. Before I do that, I'll tell you a little bit about what I do. As I mentioned, I study education in Afghanistan, for example. What does this mean in practice? It means I travel to places that take a really long time to get to, and have security risks associated with foreigners showing up there. I also work in Pakistan. I've also worked in Bosnia, Armenia, in South America and Central America. It also means that I spend a lot of time building relationships with people who work in these places, organizations and individuals both. And it means that I get to spend a lot of time designing the kinds of studies that Steve isn't excited about. I work on mixed methods, randomized controlled trials. And I like to call them radical randomized controlled trials because I don't think that I am guilty of the errors that Steve has pointed out, although I realize that many colleagues are. I like to think that we do something a little bit different in my research, and I'll tell you about that. So I'm particularly interested in understanding how to support governments in discovering the best ways to promote quality education, access to quality education for girls and boys across their countries. I'm particularly interested in understanding the effects of humanitarian aid to humanitarian aid to education on girls and boys, enrollment, achievement, and on communities, for example, communities' voices in institutions, trust in government. With this in mind, I studied a community-based schools program, community-based education program in Afghanistan. Starting in 2005, I actually still continue this work. I'll be happy to talk more about it if you're interested. In 2005, as the conflict began to reemerge in Afghanistan, I started to explore how foreign funding, including taxpayer dollars, could support education for all, particularly girls, even in the midst of war. My co-author on that study, Lee Linden, and I carried out a field experiment, otherwise known as a randomized controlled trial, to test the effects of community-based schools on the enrollment and achievement of girls and boys in remote Afghan villages. Community-based schools, this was the program that I studied was actually funded and implemented by CRS, by Catholic Relief Services. I studied their work. We didn't implement any education programs ourselves as researchers. Community-based schools are set up in a large house or a mosque, and teachers come from the local community. This also, I was excited that Bob refers to community education in Zambia. It's quite different in Zambia because it's not linked, community education, from what we just heard, is not linked to the government. In Afghanistan, it is. It's actually linked to the Ministry of Education. It's very much supported by international organizations, however, and has struggled to integrate itself into the government system. So these schools are set up in a large house or mosque. Teachers come from the local community. An aid organization delivers government-approved textbooks and supplies and trains the teachers and parents who help oversee the school. The Afghan government usually integrates these schools into the larger education system. Certifying teachers, these teachers, as was described earlier, are not actually typically working with the same level of qualification certification as official government-trained teachers. But eventually teachers are certified and government pays their salaries. The salaries do not come from the communities because that doesn't work. You can't put the burden of education payment on the people who are least able to bear it. Our study shows that community-based schools significantly increase enrollment test scores among boys and girls in Afghanistan. In fact, particularly for girls, these schools eliminate the gender disparity in enrollment eliminate the gender disparity in enrollment, and dramatically reduce differences in test scores. Girls' attendance rates in these remote Afghan villages increased from 19%. Just want you to absorb that number, that figure. When they were walking long distances to school, there were only 19% of them who were accessing school, and that figure went up to approximately 70% after the introduction of community-based schools, and boys' attendance rates rose from 35% to 70%. Girls' average test scores increased significantly, although these schools didn't quite close the achievement gap between boys and girls. And in that part of the world, it's unusual. Girls are testing at lower levels than boys, which is atypical in the West. Girls usually outperform boys. Although many in the West think that Afghans, let me also add that we show that as the distance to school increases, children's enrollment falls dramatically for each additional mile, and again, girls are more affected than boys. Many in the West think that Afghans reject schools or that only boys can attend them. Although there's a significant interest here in the US in educating girls in Afghanistan, that was a big feature for those of you who remember of Laura Bush's First Lady campaign before and after the invasion in 2001. Although there is significant interest here in the US in educating girls in Afghanistan, our understanding of the local commitment to these initiatives is limited. In my study, although we show that once a school is placed in a village, parents are equally likely to send both their boys and their girls to school. Western misconceptions about Afghan attitudes, and not only Afghan but Muslim attitudes towards education, continue to raise questions among Westerners. Here in the US and on our university campuses, these questions and suspicions combine now with other activities strongly associated with Islam in the media, most recently from what I like to call the un-Islamic state. So it's not unusual to hear a litany of condemnations of Islam voiced by non-Muslims. These fears may start with, for example, Muslims don't believe in girls' education, and end with comments that are far more extreme. Yet neither the men in Afghanistan nor Pakistan who try to prevent girls from going to school, nor the violent extremists who have taken over territory in Syria and Iraq are shrinking. Actually, their territory is shrinking in Syria and Iraq. But neither of these groups represent the vast majority of Muslims in the world, as I think most of you know. In fact, the majority of Muslims around the world do not support either these positions or the dangerous men who promote them. What does that have to do with us at home? You might ask. How does that affect us here? Every time one of us shows ignorance about and intolerance toward Islam, we enable small acts of exclusion toward others in our society who are actually exactly the people we need at times like this. And we help the un-Islamic state and other intolerant extremists widen a wedge between us, for argument's sake, I'll say tolerant Westerners, and mainstream Muslims. In addition, we undermine all the people living in difficult environments who truly want peace and want their daughters to attend school. We need to educate ourselves. This is where the lifelong learning part comes in. We need to educate ourselves and promote tolerance in our universities so that we don't buy into myths about Islamic values that can offend the very people we intend to support. We should know that the Quran mandates education for both boys and girls, and most Afghan parents want their girls to get an education. They just don't want them to walk long distances to school because it's dangerous. This isn't to say that families living in Afghanistan do not face huge challenges in sending girls to school. They do, of course. It's not to say that every person living in Afghanistan thinks girls should attend school. They don't. My point is that we need to show support for the majority of people who, despite extreme volatility and social pressure demonstrate bravery and steadfastness in sending their girls to school. I'd like to leave you with words from an illiterate mother living in Uruzgan province, one of the most conflict-affected provinces in Afghanistan, and also a province that has a literacy rate for women of about 0.05%. From this province, this woman, I conducted a study in this province in 2014. And my co-author traveled to the province and worked with the communities there to carry out the data collection. And in this province, this woman embodies the kinds of men and women everywhere with whom we must stand in solidarity for education and tolerance. And when we do, it weakens members of the un-Islamic State, for example, and every other extremist around the world, at home or abroad. This woman was interviewed for a project I was working on in 2014, as I mentioned. In describing her efforts to keep her daughter in school, she said this: "My neighbor was criticizing me for sending my daughter to school. I asked, 'Have you seen my daughter not saying salam to you? Not treating you with respect? Does she curse or steal? Please tell me.' The neighbor replied, 'No, she doesn't do those things.' I said, 'I will move to another place, but I will not stop sending my daughter to school.'" Thank you very much.
So yesterday I taught a class, and it was for students who were going to Ireland for a week-long course in the summer, and I summarized all of kind of Irish politics and history in 1 hour, and everything I talked about for about 4 minutes could be a whole class, and I feel like that's what this session is right here. Each of the things that our speakers have spoken about, we could spend hours on, and we have about 22 minutes. So again, you've talked a lot about just really fascinating things in terms of what we know, who knows it, how we know it, and what do we do with it. And so I guess I'll ask maybe 2 quick questions, and maybe we'll try to keep our responses short, and then we'll open it up to the audience. The first is, and you've all touched on this in different ways in terms of kind of best practices, but I guess be curious, we are in this kind of inflection point from moving from access to quality. We are in this kind of hyper-measurement era. We know that research is important, but so I guess I'd be curious to know from each of your perspectives, what is the role of research in this new era of measurement, at the same time not getting swallowed up by technocracy? What is your sense of that? What are the best practice from your own personal experiences in terms of the role of research in kind of tackling some of the key questions you've identified?
I'm going to just go down the line.
Sure.
So I should maybe not speak first because I just spoke.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. So I'm actually a huge fan, as I mentioned, of critical research studies, as I like to call them, radical RCTs. I think the dilemma is really what Radhika pointed out, which is how do you get evidence into the hands of policymakers? How do you get policymakers to read briefs, even briefs? I actually asked this question of Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, and she didn't know how to answer. She said, keep it short. But we do that already. So I think that's really, the real challenge is, as we know, political decisions are based on politics, not as often as we would like on evidence. How do we make politics about the evidence?
I serve as the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Educational Development. We publish 6 times a year. I receive 700 articles a year that I read. The biggest problem is that they're saying the same thing. Very often they repeat themselves. They're about issues that have been settled long ago, and the authors often don't know it. What is the role of research? The role of research is to say something different. the role of research is to teach us something that we did not know. The role of research, and I can only speak for myself, but as somebody who helped make policy at the bank, if the research was really pioneering, if it was really interesting, you read it, and then did you act on it fast? So the role of research, the role of good research, is as it always has been. It's to innovate. It's to lead us in a new direction. And it's up to us as researchers to make that more common.
I think it's a very important question, and just to give you a sense of the role of research in my work, just to give an example, when we realize that children are not reading in these government schools and community centers, but what tool should we use to test them? We can't use the government tools, we can't use the government examination because everyone passes in the examination, irrespective. We wanted to have something very simple that could be done without disrupting the class, but the tool should be reliable and valid and should have all psychometric properties. So again, the role of research should be to understand the context, use what is already out there, but also make a link between filling in the gaps and giving tools to, and be very cognizant of the fact that there won't be much money, there won't be specialized people doing these assessments, and also should be very easy to understand for the policymakers. So again, the role of research is a huge task. It has lots of holes. Unfortunately, many policymakers, many bureaucrats don't have access to very good journals. So how can we translate the material, the innovative material that's there in these research journals to some policymakers who can make an impact on the ground?
I think if you look at the health sector compared to the education sector, you find that a lot of policy making is very data-driven. Education has been late to the game in terms of getting good data on a lot of important elements, such as just was mentioned in terms of reading, for instance. When I was at the Global Partnership for Education, we made a commitment that all of the 60 or so countries we were working with would collect good data on learning on reading outcomes and mathematics outcomes. We've come close to meeting that commitment, not quite, and it's not as regular as it should be. There is something of a backlash against testing more broadly. I'm talking more here testing, but it's you need to have good data to feed into the research. I think that a lot of that comes from a Western perspective, where tests have been used for purposes quite different from what we're seeing in developing countries. Just as recently as the last 2 months or so, you've had strong pushback against testing children for reading and math at primary school level from several key organizations internationally as part of the dialogue around what indicators would be used for the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, I think it's coming from this misplaced sense that there's too much testing going on. No, I think it's quite the opposite so far in most of our countries, but at least we have some data now, and when there's data, to me this is also a fairness issue. When you have data, then you start to get some attention, and you have a chance that the poorest children who haven't been given good quality opportunities to learn, that they actually start getting those chances.
I have a couple more questions, but I'm going to come back to them at the very last couple of minutes. So maybe we'll open it up from the floor. We have microphones. If you would just raise your hand, and we'll bring the mic to you so that everyone can hear, because this is being recorded. Sure, go ahead, Susan.
So I'm sort of interested, I think that we are in a position in America of sort of judging where our education system should go. Recently, Indiana decided we are not having the individual I-STEP test anymore, and they're looking for a solution. So it sort of strikes me that we don't know what we want for the ideal in the most wealthy of circumstances. The Indiana kid who has access to the 1,000 or 100,000 words a day. How are we to be in the position of putting out a solution for other places if we really haven't found the solution for ourselves?
Anyone want to take a stab at that? Sorry? Dana's looking at you, Bob.
Okay. Well, I think, I mean, it's a valid question, and it gets to the key point in development. What is the role of international organizations in development as a whole? That's a broader question than I'm going to be able to answer here, certainly. But I think it's fair to say that we have a lot of experience on testing issues, and it's an obligation at least to share that experience. I don't think we're putting out solutions, and I don't think ultimately the final decisions rest with us. But to me, it's a question of sharing the experience that we have, and certainly when it comes to testing, countries will have to find models that work for them.
One quick suggestion from my end is that I don't think US as a country should provide solutions. There are many solutions that are in the South-South model. For example, there is a NGO in India which developed these tests to do nationwide testing in India, ASAR. That model came to Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, in Ovezo, Pakistan also now, Pakistan ASAR. So again, there are solutions that are coming up. I guess our role should be to see how we can, again, best use the research to inform them on what is possible, what is not possible, give them an array of things that are possible, rather than saying that we know the right way, and that doesn't really work. We know that from our past MDG experience.
What raises such an important thing about, and it's in the background of everything we're talking about, the role of kind of the international, the national, the local, and what's kind of the interplay of those different levels. So, TJ.
Thank you. So a number of you spoke to kind of around the context of where we are today at a faith-based university. I just would ask a question about how you see the interplay between faith-based organizations in particular, as well as other non-governmental organizations working in collaboration with the state, and how you see that going forward in this work.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do work really closely with CRS, and I've done that now since 2005, and it's an organization I have an enormous amount of respect for, but a lot of the reason I have so much respect for it is because they, as I said, they don't proselytize. And they're very clear about providing aid equitably and without attention to creed, religion, race, etc. And they work well with states that served them well, so they are able, I think, to do as much as they are able to do because they hold that model because they consider it so important to follow those rules. I mean, I guess I do think that it's a slippery slope. As I said, not all faith-based organizations act like that, and when I say that, I mean the gamut of faith-based, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, which are the three monotheistic. I like to call it the monotheistic trifecta. But when we think about those, we typically think of those organizations. Of course, in other places, we also see other faith-based organizations that have issues. In Thailand, you have Burmese. We have faith-based tensions everywhere, right? So I don't mean to isolate those three religions as unique.
I think, in my experience, faith-based organizations play a critical role, in part by modeling good behavior, and in part by how they treat those of other faiths. In particular, faith-based linked universities play this role when you ask, well, what do they teach about the faith that's not their primary linkage? Part of the problem in some cases is that some religious organizations don't understand that you can have a faith-based affiliated university that teaches with respect the role of other religions. That's an enormously important lesson for universities in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan when they are considering Islam, for example, as part of their linkages. So faith-based organizations can set the pattern for all of them if they behave well. And I think there's a role for us to ask, well, what is a proper role of a faith-based organization? And where do you draw the line? What constitutes discrimination in terms of entry and what constitutes inappropriate attitudes toward those of other faiths? If we're able to how do you study the history in which there has been faith-based conflict? How do you study it appropriately? The role of universities in this regard, I think, is preeminently important.
So an example of a faith-based organization doing a fantastic job is from northern Ghana. Northern Ghana, if you know, is very rural and remote. There are the region that we work in, there are two local languages there, Mampruli and Buli. The two local languages are almost getting extinct because it's a script that is not being taught in the schools. The schools are being taught some other regional language, which neither the parents nor the teachers nor the local children know. And it's just because of this faith-based organization that works in northern Ghana that at least we have the survival of these two languages, because they are doing a lot of community-based literacy work. Now our role is how can the material that is created for this, through this organization that is doing a tremendous work in the communities, how can children use those textbooks and how can they be translated into some like a basic textbook that children can read and write in their own language. So I think there's a lot of gaps and loopholes here, but I think they have a critical role in at least what I have seen is to promote local literacy in that language.
I think just very simply that faith-based organizations matter in a positive way when they see an important role for themselves in contributing to public policy. And I think if they don't, then they're severely limited in the impact they can have.
Given that we have the next panel coming in 10 minutes, and we want to give people at least 5-minute break between them, I want to ask a question. I want to thank you for a terrific panel, and we all have patience with students who have to go to class coming in and out, so thanks for not being disturbed by the traffic. And I'm going to ask a ridiculously big question and only give you a minute or so to respond, each of you. That's apparently my style. So from a naive perspective, and that is my own, listening to all of you, I wouldn't call it a culture of complaint up on the panels exactly, because there have been some positive reports and some signs of hope. I'm going to ask you to think a little bit comparatively. We've had panels on global health. We've had panels on economic development. And the general sense that you're giving is that international education lags behind. They all have their challenges, and some of the challenges seem to overlap. But that you're not satisfied. Bob is the person who articulated it most clearly, but so did Steve. You're not satisfied with the progress. Would it be fair to conclude that this sector of international education has lagged behind for various reasons? If that's not the case, explain that to us. And why do you think that's so? You've all kind of given specific suggestions about that. So either debunk that premise that it's lagged behind and it's really an area that needs special attention, even more so than some of these other inchoate areas. If that's not true, say why. If you agree, why is that the case? And summarize very quickly what would jumpstart it in 1 minute.
Go ahead, Steve.
It is the case. We do lag behind. I can give personal evidence because I was there in the beginning when the Soviet Union fell apart, and I watched other sectors in the former Soviet Union pick up knowledge, public health very fast, environment protection, nuclear disarmament. very quickly, macroeconomics, trade policy, and last is education. Last because they thought they had all problems were solved. So both attention and the quality of talent devoted to it was last on the list. And I think I've been in this field for 45 years, so I've seen this play out in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and many other places. So we're a field that's characterized by lack of consensus. We have an abundance of what I call single solution specialists, people who have a solution before you tell them the problem. And irredentists, those are people who say, unless it's invented locally, it's not legitimate. So we are overrun by true believers of one sort or another, including those, I've written an article called The Failure of Education for All as Political Strategy, published by UNESCO, by the way. And the point was that our entry into education for all, the reason why we in the World Bank agreed to participate and help lead it, was to garner attention to education generally, not to focus attention solely on primary education. And yet the world has interpreted basic education for all as a license to ignore the complexity and beauty and interrelationships of the sector as a whole.
So I'm not as pessimistic as Steve. I don't think you're that pessimistic. Older than I look.
Wait a minute.
Anyway, what I was going to say, I was there too, by the way, the former Soviet Union when it was collapsing. So, but what I was going to say in seriousness is I am not as pessimistic as that. I don't think Steve is as pessimistic as that either. I do think that there are magic bullets in health. There are vaccines. There is an evidence gap between health and education, and I think that's probably part of the problem with if we perceive education as lagging, and maybe we do, maybe we don't. I guess I would wonder also, is it lagging domestically or not? I'm not that familiar with domestic education beyond the issues that I read about in the paper, of course. It's not something that I've ever researched, but I think we haven't solved the problems. Is it because every parent thinks they're an expert on education? Everyone's had education. They think they're an expert. This is part of maybe what Steve is referring to, this idea that everybody thinks they have a solution before understanding what the evidence says about that question, the open question that exists. So I think all of these issues line up to hold progress back somewhat or delay progress. But in Afghanistan, for example, really through very little, without enormous amount of effort in places where international efforts did not reach, Afghan government on its own still did increase education up to 40% for girls and 60% for boys, and that's pretty remarkable. From close to, we don't know the exact figures when the Taliban was in power, but it was probably hovering around 10% for boys and less for girls. So I am encouraged. I think this, when you see the demand for education from parents is universal. It's universally high. There's virtually no variation. So studies about demand are not interesting because we know the answer to those questions. And that's encouraging. This is a train that's left the station. People who are trying to hold back girls' education, trying to hold back other kinds of education, are not going to be successful. So I think that holds promise for us. Thanks.
Radhika and then Bob.
Just a 30-second reply. I think definitely education is lagging behind health and other sectors. Whenever I think and ask my colleagues, why is this happening, the only answer I get is education is very complex. It's not like a pill that you give to the health, you cured malaria and HIV. But for God's sake, how difficult is it to improve reading when children are going to school? It's not even People are curing malaria, HIV, TB. We can't even educate children in schools and make them literate as per their grade standard. I think it's a big excuse. And to actually, I resonate with Bob's speech that finance is a big issue for us. I think we need to really get more finance to get more things going.
Yes, it's lagged behind. It's not to say other sectors have always gotten everything right either. I think education has actually done better on kind of paying attention to systems issues than the health sector has, where I think some of the interventions have introduced a lot of distortions. But no question education has lagged behind. I wish I had a simple answer for it. I think it's partially because education overlaps with so many national sovereignty issues, social cohesion issues, so many real political issues at the country level. It's been very difficult for the donors to find their way through that. And in the initial going, they tended to just steer clear.
Well, it's clear, our dean here, that we have a growth industry, and we're really grateful to our panelists for, because you really are experts, and helping us to think about how we might play a role, because we don't want to just talk about it, we want to do something, because we obviously here believe that all children are made in the image and likeness of God, and they can learn, and they will learn if we help them. So thank you for helping us to engage this really important topic, and we'll take a 5-minute break and be back.